و عواقب او رو که صلاح این کشور و این ملت هست اون رو انجام بدن.
Night falls over Iran, but the darkness does not bring silence. Sirens echo through narrow streets. Fires burn where police stations once stood. A woman with a bloodied face stares into a phone camera, her voice steady, her fear gone. Somewhere else a flag is torn down in a public square, its fabric ripped apart by hands that no longer believe. This is not a protest that asks for reform. It is a confrontation that questions survival. How does a state respond when obedience evaporates? And what happens when those tasked with enforcing order begin to hesitate or worse, step aside? Iran has entered a phase that regimes fear most loss of narrative control. What began as scattered demonstrations has hardened into a rolling national uprising, now stretching across major cities and smaller towns alike. Reports describe police units overwhelmed by crowds armed with little more than stones retreating under pressure that grows by the hour. In several urban centers, government symbols have been destroyed in full view of cameras, the images spreading faster than authorities can contain them. This visibility matters. In modern uprisings, perception can be as decisive as firepower. The scale is difficult to verify, but analysts point to a dangerous threshold. Political scientists have long argued that when roughly 4% of a population engages in sustained protest, even authoritarian systems begin to crack. In a country of nearly 90 million people, that number represents millions in motion. Streets fill not only in Tehran, but in industrial hubs, transport corridors, and provincial cities that once formed the regime's backbone. Decentralization has become the protesters' greatest advantage. There is no single square to clear, no single leader to arrest. The regime's legitimacy problem runs deeper than economics or sanctions. It is strategic and psychological. The memory of last year's 12-day confrontation with Israel still hangs heavy. That conflict exposed limits many Iranians had suspected, but never seen so clearly the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and battlefield reality. When a government builds its authority on strength and defiance, visible weakness corrodes loyalty from within. The statues coming down now are not just metal and stone, they are symbols of a myth collapsing. Outside Iran's borders, the situation is being watched with unusual intensity. In Washington, President Donald Trump, now back in the Oval Office, has sent deliberately stark signals. Public warnings emphasize restraint by Iranian security forces, framing mass violence as a red line that would trigger consequences. The language is calculated firm enough to be heard in Tehran, ambiguous enough to preserve options. It reflects a broader American strategy shaped by recent history pressure without occupation leverage, without entanglement. The first hours of a revolution rarely decide its outcome, but they set its tone. Iran is now past that opening act. Authority is contested. Fear has shifted sides. The question is no longer whether the streets will calm down on their own. The question is whether the state still believes it can reassert control without shattering itself in the process. And if it cannot, who moves next? By the second week, the choreography of dissent had changed. What once followed a predictable script march chant dispersed now unfolded as something far more volatile. Protesters no longer gathered only in symbolic squares. They moved through neighborhoods, industrial zones, and transport arteries, forcing security forces to respond everywhere at once. Videos circulating from city to city showed police stations ransacked vehicles set ablaze and officers retreating under a hail of rocks. The imbalance was striking, not because protesters were better armed, but because they were everywhere. This dispersion is what makes the moment dangerous for the state. Authoritarian systems are designed to crush centralized opposition. They struggle against movements without a single head to cut off. In smaller cities, local commanders faced impossible choices. Reinforcements were slow or non-existent. Orders from Tehran arrived late or not at all. In some cases, officers simply vanished from their posts. In others, crowds overwhelmed defenses by sheer persistence. Each retreat fed the next demonstration. Momentum became contagious. Symbolism amplified the effect. In one city center, demonstrators pulled down the regime's flag and tore it apart. The act, filmed from multiple angles, shared within minutes. Elsewhere, a bus linked to paramilitary forces burned through the night flames, reflecting off apartment windows as residents watched in silence. Religious schools, long seen by critics as ideological factories, were attacked and set alight. These were not random targets. They represented the pillars of the system: coercion, indoctrination, obedience. Destroying them was a declaration that fear no longer worked. Perhaps most unsettling for the authorities were the voices emerging from unexpected places. Some clerics once silent or loyal appeared on recordings calling openly for the removal of the supreme leader. In a theocracy, such defiance cuts deeper than street violence. It fractures the moral architecture of power. When religious legitimacy erodes, force alone must carry the burden, and force is finite. The most jarring images came from acts of direct violence against the state. In one incident, a police commander was killed in broad daylight, the attack recorded and circulated by the group claiming responsibility. The footage itself could not be shown on mainstream platforms, but its existence spread rapidly, fueling both fear and resolve. For supporters of the regime, it signaled chaos. For opponents, it proved vulnerability. Once again, perception did the work of weapons. Authorities responded as they always have: threats of internet blackouts, warnings of harsh reprisals, hints of a coming crackdown. But this time, control of information proved elusive. Satellite connections and smuggled technology kept channels open. Each attempt to silence the streets seemed only to confirm the regime's weakness. The longer the unrest continued, the more costly repression appeared, not just in lives, but in legitimacy. Iran had crossed from protest into confrontation. The streets were no longer asking to be heard. They were daring the state to act, knowing that any move might accelerate the very collapse it sought to prevent. Inside the machinery of the state, stress fractures were beginning to show. Authoritarian power depends not only on orders issued from the top, but on thousands of mid-level actors choosing to obey them. As unrest intensified, that assumption weakened. Reports from multiple cities describe security units refusing to engage commanders, hesitating, and in some cases entire police stations abandoned before protesters even arrived. These were not dramatic defections announced on television. They were quiet absences, posts left, empty streets left unguarded, that spoke volumes. For the leadership in Tehran, this was the nightmare scenario. A regime can survive popular anger if its coercive core remains intact. It struggles when loyalty becomes conditional. The calculus facing officers on the ground had changed. Enforcing order now meant personal risk without clear assurance of victory. In a decentralized uprising, every confrontation carried the possibility of isolation. No commander wants to be the one caught on camera ordering lethal force, only to see the regime fall weeks later. The traditional response loomed: cut the internet, blind the streets, and act in the dark. Iran has used this tactic before with brutal efficiency, but the environment was no longer the same. Satellite-based connections and smuggled terminals complicated total shutdowns. Even partial connectivity allowed images and testimonies to leak out, shaping international reaction in real time. Each delay increased scrutiny. Each blackout threat raised expectations of violence. External pressure compounded the dilemma. Washington's messaging was deliberately blunt. Public statements warned against mass killings, framing them as a trigger for consequences rather than an internal affair. The subtext was unmistakable: the world was watching and deniability was shrinking. This posture fit a broader American pattern seen in recent crises: maximum psychological pressure paired with flexible response options. No promise of invasion, no tolerance for slaughter. The regime's inner circle faced a narrowing corridor of choices. A full crackdown risked international isolation and internal rupture. Restraint risked emboldening the streets. Time once an ally was turning hostile. Every day without decisive action allowed the protest movement to normalize defiance and test the limits of state power. In revolutions, hesitation can be fatal. Technology played an unexpected role in this standoff. The mere presence of alternative communication networks altered behavior. Officers knew their actions might surface online within minutes. Protesters knew they were not entirely cut off from the outside world. This mutual awareness changed the psychology of repression. Fear, once monopolized by the state, was now distributed. Iran was approaching a point where control could not be restored quietly. Whatever decision came next, violent suppression, negotiated retreat, or internal fracture, would leave a permanent mark. The system was no longer managing unrest, it was reacting to it, and reaction in moments like this is rarely enough. What is unfolding in Iran does not exist in isolation. It mirrors a pattern that has defined global conflict over the past decade, where internal unrest, external pressure, and information warfare collide. The images from Iranian streets echo scenes seen elsewhere. Cities under strained governments testing the limits of forced societies, weighing fear against defiance. In this sense, Iran has become another front in a wider contest over how power is exercised in the 21st century. In Ukraine, war exposed a similar dynamic. A state under existential pressure relied on popular mobilization, decentralized resistance, and constant visibility to survive. There too, control of the narrative proved decisive. Footage from the front lines reshaped international opinion, unlocked foreign support, and hardened domestic resolve. Iran's protesters have drawn their own conclusions from that conflict. Visibility invites solidarity, silence invites repression. The comparison extends to the Middle East. The brief but intense Israel-Iran confrontation last year revealed the fragility of deterrence built on reputation rather than capability. Precision strikes, intelligence penetration, and rapid escalation shattered assumptions that had underpinned Tehran's posture for years. For many Iranians, that conflict punctured a myth that their leaders could project strength abroad while maintaining control at home. Once that myth faded, obedience became negotiable. Beyond the battlefield, economic and technological pressure campaigns offer another parallel. In the standoff between the United States and China, coercion rarely takes the form of direct conflict. It is applied through sanctions, information dominance, and selective disruption. Iran now faces a similar environment. Its leadership must calculate not only domestic survival, but how each move reverberates through global markets, alliances, and public opinion. Every crackdown risks tightening the economic vice. Every concession risks appearing weak. These similarities point to a larger transformation in how crises unfold. Power is no longer exercised solely through tanks and battalions. It flows through data, images, and perception. States that fail to adapt find themselves reacting to events they no longer control. Iran's leadership was built for an earlier era, one where shutting down a city meant shutting down a movement. That assumption no longer holds. For Washington, this convergence reinforces a strategic lesson. Influence can be exerted without invasion. Pressure can be applied without occupation. President Trump's administration has emphasized deterrence through clarity and restraint, signaling boundaries while avoiding irreversible commitments. It is a model shaped by past interventions and present limitations. Iran now stands where several others have stood before, at the intersection of domestic revolt and global scrutiny. History suggests that once a regime reaches this stage, outcomes accelerate. Either control is reasserted at enormous cost, or the system transforms under pressure it can no longer contain. The world has seen both endings. The question is, which one Iran is moving toward? Amid strategy and geopolitics, the human dimension presses forward with relentless force. Behind every viral clip is a decision made by an individual who knows the risks and steps forward anyway. Families watch from balconies as crowds surge below, torn between fear and a quiet sense of pride. Parents warn their children to stay inside, then hear chants echoing through the night and realize those warnings no longer carry weight. This is what societal rupture looks like, not dramatic all at once, but personal, cumulative, irreversible. In Iran, the uprising has blurred lines that once seemed fixed. Civilians confront armed men. Clerics question a system built in their name. Young conscripts weigh orders against conscience. Each choice narrows future options. For security personnel, the moral cost of obedience grows heavier with every casualty. For protesters, retreat feels increasingly impossible. Once fear breaks, it rarely reforms in the same shape. The violence, though still uneven, leaves scars that will not fade quickly. Deaths reported by human rights groups ripple through communities, turning anger into resolve. Funerals become rallies. Mourning turns public. In authoritarian systems, grief is often private contained. Here it spills into the streets, demanding recognition. The regime understands this danger well. That is why it has historically acted fast and brutally, severing communication and overwhelming resistance before grief can organize itself. Yet this time, restraint and brutality collide with global attention. Images of wounded protesters burning buildings and deserted police posts circulate far beyond Iran's borders. Each frame humanizes the crisis for an international audience accustomed to abstractions. Sanctions debates, diplomatic statements, and strategic warnings suddenly acquire faces. This visibility constrains choices on all sides. It also raises expectations among Iranians themselves that the world will not look away. For ordinary people, the cost is immediate and intimate. Jobs vanish as cities shut down, schools close, supply chains strain, anxiety becomes routine. But alongside fear, something else spreads a sense that history is moving, and that standing still carries its own risk. Revolutions feed on this psychology. They advance not because everyone is brave, but because enough people decide they can no longer live as before. The regime's greatest challenge may lie here. Even if order is restored, the relationship between state and society has changed. Trust once broken is not easily repaired by force. Memories of who stood where during these days will linger in neighborhoods, workplaces, and families. The question is no longer only who controls the streets tomorrow, but how a country heals or fractures further after the shouting fades. Iran's uprising has reduced grand strategy to its simplest terms: power versus legitimacy, survival versus meaning. And for millions caught in between, the outcome will define not just a political system, but the shape of everyday life for a generation. Iran is approaching a decision point where delay itself becomes a choice. The streets have forced the regime into a narrow corridor, one that grows tighter with every passing day. Escalation risks international response and internal fracture. Restraint risks emboldening a movement that has already crossed psychological thresholds. History shows that when authoritarian systems hesitate at this stage, outcomes tend to accelerate rather than stabilize. From Washington's perspective, the crisis tests a broader doctrine of American power. Under President Donald Trump, the United States has emphasized deterrence without occupation pressure, without prolonged war. Public warnings directed at Tehran are designed to shape behavior, not announce intervention. The signal is clear: mass repression will not be treated as an internal matter, yet ambiguity remains intentional. It preserves leverage, keeps allies aligned, and leaves room for events on the ground to unfold. This balance between security and freedom defines the moment. For the Iranian leadership, security has long justified repression. For protesters, freedom has become inseparable from survival. When these concepts collide, compromise narrows. The world has seen similar moments before, when governments discovered too late that coercion cannot restore belief, and belief cannot be rebuilt quickly enough to prevent collapse. Globally, the implications extend beyond Iran. Allies and rivals alike are watching how far the United States is willing to go to defend norms without repeating past mistakes. They are watching whether visibility and pressure can substitute for force. They are watching whether modern uprisings, fueled by decentralized organization and persistent communication, can outpace systems built for control. For Iranians, the question is more immediate. What happens after the chants fade? If the regime survives, it will govern a society transformed by defiance. If it falls, the struggle to build something new will begin under the weight of expectation and trauma. Either path carries risk, neither offers easy answers. The streets have spoken, the state must respond, and the world must decide what it is willing to accept, what it is willing to confront, and what it is willing to defend. When authority trembles and fear changes sides, history rarely pauses. It moves forward often faster than anyone expects. The only question left is who will shape what comes next. Iran's uprising has evolved from protest into a national confrontation that challenges the foundations of state power. Decentralized demonstrations, symbolic acts of defiance, and visible cracks within the security apparatus have shifted the balance of fear. The regime faces a narrowing set of options: repress at enormous cost or restrain itself and risk losing control. Technology, global scrutiny, and external pressure, particularly from the United States, have complicated traditional tactics such as information blackouts and rapid crackdowns. Comparisons with Ukraine, Middle Eastern conflicts, and great power rivalry reveal a common pattern. Modern crises are shaped as much by perception and visibility as by force. For ordinary Iranians, the human cost is immediate, while the long-term consequences will define a generation. Even if order is restored, legitimacy has been damaged and trust fractured. For the world, the crisis tests whether influence can be exercised without invasion, and whether deterrence can protect civilians without triggering wider war. Iran now stands at a historic crossroads. What happens next will not only determine the country's future, but signal how power resistance and accountability interact in an era where authority is constantly watched and constantly challenged.